I'm pleased to ask Mr. Santana to come before us to present his report entitled City at a Crossroads. And this was a report that we heard in the Budget and Finance Committee, which I think sets forth an appropriate context for us to begin our consideration of where we are in terms of our budget and how we begin to address the challenges that we still face. The next fiscal year was projected to have a deficit of over $1 billion just 4 years ago. That number has been whittled down now considerably to in the neighborhood of $200 million. And that's been as a result of cuts. It's been a result of reductions in services to our constituents. It's been a result of contributions that our partners in labor have made, sacrifices that they've been made. It's been due in part to improvements in the economy, a variety of factors. But it's unquestionably true that we have made considerable progress in trying to address that very significant challenge that we faced. There still is a very significant budget deficit that we're facing, a structural component of this budget deficit that we face both for the coming fiscal year and for at least the fiscal year after that, and perhaps more. So Mr. Santana is going to lay that out, I think, in a way that will be very clear, but I think it's an appropriate way for us to start the budget season, and I hope that members will be mindful of the facts that Mr. Santana is going to be laying out as we enter the budget season. So, Mr. Santana.
Thank you. Miguel Santana, CEO. That is correct in terms of what has just been presented. The city has made significant progress over the last 4 years in addressing a major structural challenge. Today, the deficit is projected to be at approximately 216, if we go to the next slide, that represents a significant reduction of over $1 billion from 4 years ago. It's important to point out as we look at the 216 that, of course, that represents a moment in time of when we identify the deficit. The deficit is identified each year when the mayor releases his budget on April 20th. That number will change again on April 20th when that budget is released. And we know coming into the season that in fact things are improving. We know we'll be paying about $45 million less in our pension costs, much as a result of the very difficult decisions that all of you have made, and the contributions that the men and women who work for the City of Los Angeles are making towards retiree health care. And then we're also hoping to begin the fiscal year with hopefully about $80 million of a budget stabilization fund. And the reason you're able to do that is because, in fact, you've hit the 5% reserve fund that has been a city policy for some time now. And so with those two pieces, it is a good place to begin the budget, reducing the projected deficit as we see today. At the same time, we also know our expenditures are also growing. In the police department and fire departments alone, they've asked for over $144 million of new spending for next fiscal year. Some of it already captured in the deficit, but frankly, most of it not. And so the deficit fluctuates, and so it is finally identified at when the mayor releases his budget. So the first chart shows the various pieces of how you were able to reduce that. And it's important to remind us of what that was like 4 years ago under the leadership of, at that point, President Garcetti, Mr. Parks, who chaired Budget and Finance, and the leadership of your council, Ms. Perry, Mr. Smith, and of course Mr. Zine. The city was able to make some significant efforts to reduce a deficit from 4 years ago that started off being 320 and it ended up close to $500 million in 1 year alone. And that challenged the city to not just deal with the deficit on a short-term basis, but engage in a long-term strategy to finally bring us to fiscal health. And so there's various pieces to that puzzle. The most significant piece is, of course, pension savings, $263 million with pension savings that had been generated due to our employees contributing towards retiree health care, due to changes done at both pension systems, and as well as through the pension reform that's been adopted on the sworn side and that will become effective on the civilian side effective July 1st. And so originally we had projected a pension cost of over $1 billion. Just a few years ago, it's now down to 999. It's important to point out that our pension costs continue to grow, but they're not growing at the same rate as was originally projected 4 years ago. In addition to that, we've seen cuts throughout departments. Those cuts are significant when you think about the kind of service levels that we're expected to provide. As a whole, the city is 15% smaller than it was 4 years ago, with over 5,000 positions eliminated throughout the city. Now, as we proceed forward with a budget shortfall of 216, and as I said, dropping, we know that how we do so is becoming more and more difficult. One way of looking, if you look at the next slide, is that of the entire budget of $7.2 billion that you oversee, half of it is restricted. Half of it are revenue streams that have a specific purpose that can't be used to pay for police officers or firefighters. And so those funds are intended for a specific service. The other half, almost the other half, 47%, pay for police, fire, library, recreation and parks, public works, transportation, building safety, planning, and the convention center. So only about 5% of the discretionary dollars that you have oversight covers animal services, city attorney, controller, my office, cultural affairs, emergency management, the mayor, your offices, the city clerk, disability, zoo, and a handful of others. That's 5%. The total amount of that is about $359 million. The context of the sales tax discussion is really about how do you solve a $200+ million deficit, which is projected to grow even greater than that the following years, when the only room you have left to protect public safety and other core services is about 5% of the discretionary funding. And so that's the question that's before the voters of Los Angeles, and a challenge that the chair of Budget and Finance and the rest of the committee have to engage in on an annual basis. So people say, well, there has to be more places to cut. So let's go through some of the departments that have in fact experienced significant reductions. In 2006-07, the zoo used to receive a subsidy of over $10.6 million, beyond this general fund covering the related costs. That subsidy is now down to $1.3 million. Animal services staffing levels have been reduced by over 21% since 2009-10, from 412 employees now down to 326. And the important thing to point out is that the demand for services has not changed. One way the department has been able to still deliver services at the same and frankly at an enhanced level is through the partnership that they've entered into with Best Friends, a nonprofit organization who's running the shelter out in the San Fernando Valley that was closed for many years when it opened. And so that has allowed the department to build capacity in its shelter program, improve on adoptions, and thus reduce the overall number of animals in care. GSD support departments that from public safety to virtually all departments rely on, has experienced major reductions both in terms of their funding levels as well as their staffing. GSD had a budget in 2008-09 of $225 million. Now it's down to $158. How that's reflected in staffing, they've gone from 1,916 employees down to 1,262. ITA, another department that's been heavily hit due to the last 4 years, $106 million of a budget in 2008-09 is now down to $81 million. Their staffing levels went from 807 down to 479 individuals. So it's through those cuts that we've been able to address a significant portion of our deficit. But the truth is that that has provided a significant impact on the city's ability to meet basic services. The first section is, of course, revenue, and revenue is part of the puzzle that has allowed us to reduce the structural deficit, about $177 million of the overall solutions. And one of the areas has been that the economy has in fact been improving. We've been seeing revenue grow about 2.5% every year for the last few years. In addition to that, when the state dissolved the CRA, your council and the mayor had made a decision to shift the majority of those funds back into the general fund. When the CRA was dissolved, it created an opportunity for cities to receive additional funding. And we've also been much more aggressive in going after collections throughout the city and improving in those areas. So that has allowed our revenue to grow. And finally, the other section, of course, is related to other savings that we've had, that workers have had to pay more in relation to health care and other areas. Now, I stated that while all of this has been going on, the reduction of our overall deficit, you have also maintained a commitment to a 5% reserve fund. Your reserve fund today exceeds 5% and in fact is at 5.37%. We've always stated that that is a floor. It should not be considered as the ceiling, and it should be our goal to continue to maintain a healthy reserve fund for a number of reasons. But one of the things that surprises many people when they see the success that the city has engaged in is that in fact our savings account continues to grow. And beyond that, you've also made a commitment to build a budget stabilization fund that, again, while one-time money allows us to be better protected for the uncertainty that takes place throughout the year.
We are now at the highest level of the reserve fund that we have been in how many years?
In over a decade.
In over a decade, at the time of the greatest challenges that we've had since the Great Depression, and we've been able to finally meet our financial, the obligation under our financial policies, exceed it, and in fact reach the highest reserve level in 10 years.
Right.
Thank you.
That's an important point to make, and it's something that we need when we go out to the market to borrow money. Investors want to make sure that we have the adequate reserves to pay our obligations. As I stated from the onset, the deficit is reflective of two things, obviously the growth in revenue and the growth in expenditures. And what creates the structural deficit is that in fact expenditures are growing at a faster rate than the revenues are. In public safety, it's important to point out, which makes up over 70% of your discretionary spending, those costs continue to grow. What both the fire and police systems have submitted in their budget proposals through their various commissions is over $144 million of additional spending beyond the current level. So just to maintain services at the level that we have today, not to improve them, but just simply to maintain them, the city will need to find an additional $144 million for police and fire. $53 million for salaries on the sworn side, an additional $4 million for the civilian, $36 million for increases in expenditures, $2 million for facilities, and $48 million for vehicles and equipment. You know, the police department every year makes a request to purchase police cars, and last year we had a debate as to whether to borrow the money or to actually pay it cash. The best policy is to pay it cash because the life of a vehicle is so limited. And so we need to get back to that as a process. In order to maintain public safety, there is going to be additional costs that's part of the process. The other areas, of course, in our infrastructure and our roads and streets. And one of the things that we're seeing that the city has been able to maintain its commitment to the street program, but the funding sources that support it are starting to decline, particularly funding from the state and from the federal government, as well as local taxes that we receive. The general fund subsidy over the last few years has been dramatically reduced. It's now down to practically nothing. And so in order to maintain the level of support that we currently have in our street program, the city is going to have to find additional funding, let alone to try to improve the quality of our streets. When we look at the overall expenditures that we're seeing for the next few years, obviously our expenditures with our own workforce is a major part of that. And what 80% of our revenue goes to our own employees in terms of salaries, which is 59%, 19% of overall pensions, and then there's other areas in terms of health care and workers' comp. Only about 9% include debt service and our currently deferred infrastructure fund. So over 90% of the general fund actually goes to our labor costs. And so in order to ensure the long-term financial sustainability of the city is not just important to identify new revenue sources, but it's also important to maintain a control over these costs in the future. Our challenge around pensions, I think we've talked about, through your leadership, you've been able to control and actually start reducing the speed in which those costs are growing. Our salaries are tied to compensation and contracts that have already been approved by your council and the mayor. Our healthcare costs grow around 8 to 10% each year, so finding ways to share in that cost with our employees is an important part of this process. And so how you proceed in the future in relation to 90% of your cost is going to be a critical component to the overall long-term sustainability of the city. So we'll end with the final chart. It goes back to the projected deficits that you've all seen several times over the last year. Again, a significant improvement from what we had originally projected 4 years ago, but nevertheless still a deficit. Should the sales tax measure in fact pass, we'll see the deficit as projected today to be cut half for next year, and then make a significant dent for the following subsequent years. With this increased revenue, while maintaining discipline on spending, as well as the natural growth in revenue as the economy improves, we could actually see the light at the end of the tunnel and be able to reach a point of not only eliminating the deficit altogether, but as important, start developing a revenue source to fund our infrastructure that hasn't been dealt with effectively, to start preparing us for the looming liabilities that exist, both in terms of legal challenges that we're currently facing, as well as the uncertainty at the federal government. We all know that federal sequestration is around the corner. It could be as high of a $115 million hit to the city should those cuts proceed. And as well as being able to restore services to the levels that I think most Angelenos expect. I think the question that's before most voters is the status quo acceptable? So what we're projecting, while things are in fact improving, and we outline how that is in our report, what the future looks like without the sales tax is the city's limited capacity to deal with its infrastructure, to maintain the level of services that we have today, and most importantly, to protect public safety at the existing levels. You know, the reason we highlight the fact that police and fire, just to keep the level of service that we have today, are asking for an additional $144 million for next year, is to make the point that those costs are in fact growing. We have to buy police cars. We have to maintain our equipment. We have to pay the men and women who work for both of those departments. Those are bottom line infrastructure needs that those departments need. So to do so, the revenue source needs to be there. Now, what you've sacrificed over the last few years to keep that level of service is everything else. And so we showed you how in animal services, GSD, ITA, and virtually every single department around the city, including police and fire, have had to shrink down to be able to keep that level of support. The question is, how much longer can we do that? And so that's really what's before the voters of Los Angeles, to make that determination, and then also to be in a better situation to invest in the future and in our infrastructure.
If we didn't do this 0.5% sales tax and the drift of where we're going with those other taxes, could you explain how it hurts my constituents more if they didn't go for this, without being political?
Well, I think we lay that out in our report, that the challenges now become, what else do we cut?
Right.
So, you know, we know that our revenue streams for our street program are declining. The city's general fund has practically been eliminated altogether. Yeah. To make up that loss, we're going to have to find a new revenue source just to keep the streets at the same level. When you've reduced everything else, you know, it's going to be almost impossible to avoid making additional cuts in public safety. And the current discussion that you all had as it relates to over 90 positions in the police department on the civilian side demonstrates how little flexibility we have. Being able to civilianize our dispatch unit and being able to find the funding for that. Right. Being able to remove police officers out of our jails and hire civilians will be limited by whether we have the funding for it.
It's time for us to really sit down as a council and as a city and decide what kind of city do we want to be. Do we want to continue to live hand to mouth? Do we want to continue to go through budget year after budget year, squeaking by and trying to come up with a patched together budget to get us through the year? Or do we want to start building a city that restores services, guarantees public safety, invests in infrastructure, creates an environment that's attractive to business? That's the decision that's before us as a council and before the voters of Los Angeles right now. And so I think that as we resolve that question and discuss what kind of city we want to be, we also have to be forthright, and we have to base our decisions on facts and arithmetic. And the report that you have before you is a great start in that discussion. There are those who, you know, would say that we can solve this problem by addressing waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's clearly nonsense. Is it important to continue to try to address waste, fraud, and abuse? You bet it is. We have and we will. There are those who say we can solve this problem by doing pension reform. That's nonsense. It's mathematically untrue to say that. Do we need to do more? Yes, of course. We have, and we need to continue to do more. There are some who would say that if we just attract more business, our problems will be solved. That clearly, as you look at this information before you, is not true. We need to do more of it, of course, but it's not enough in itself. There are those who would say that we can continue to expand our police department and increase the expense that we incurred on our police department without raising any taxes or doing anything else. And the numbers of those sorts of proposals simply don't add up when you look at this report. So, folks, I think it's time that we really, as a council, as a city, be honest with each other and say, what kind of city do we want to live in? What kind of city do we want to leave for our children? And what are we prepared to do to help build that city and invest in it right now? So that's the question. That's the crossroads that we're at, that's presented by this report. And as we move forward through the budget discussions in coming months, I hope that we'll be mindful of this report, mindful of the progress that we've made, but also mindful of the challenges that we have before us and of the goals that we should be setting for ourselves for the longer term. Thank you.